Vatican City, 24 March 2024. As Catholics around the world are celebrating the feast of Palm Sunday, the first day of Holy Week according to Roman Catholic tradition, with this set of worshippers gathered for the upcoming Holy Mass celebrated by none other than Pope Francis himself, where, as per tradition, Pope Francis was set to read a homily in honor of the occasion. But what would happen next was unexpected. Did you see it? Let's play it again. Yeah, that's the moment. So, believe it or not, this moment actually created quite a significant uproar within Vatican walls, as Pope Francis's decision to not read the homily during Palm Sunday Holy Mass, a timed Vatican tradition, poured heaps of fuel onto a blazing inferno within Vatican walls, as rumors were rife that Pope Francis was set to abdicate his position even as early as this year, a precedent that had been set by Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Francis's predecessor. Rumors which have in turn caused endless uproar, specifically amongst these people, the Cardinals, a group of 180 or so clergymen, each appointed by current or former popes who are only one rung below the pope in the clerical hierarchy, and who more importantly are solely responsible for voting for who, amongst one of their own select group, will become the next pope. But who amongst this group stands out above all others? Well, if you want to know the answer to that question, you're in luck, because today we ask, who will become the next pope? But before delving into that, I know what you're thinking. This is a politics channel, not a religious one, so why even ask this question? Well, dear viewer, it's precisely because this is a politics channel that this question is so important. Because whether you love it or hate it, the Vatican, to this day, still remains a major geopolitical player. And whilst its role has obviously exponentially diminished since the medieval era, in which it was arguably the center point of the globe, its role in modern geopolitics is arguably a lot more influential than most countries. For example, Pope John Paul II during the 1980s is thought to have been a central figure in the fall of communism within Eastern Europe. The Polish former pope, a powerful symbolic point of contrast between the liberal West, known for its freedom of religion, and the communist East, that often repressed religious freedoms due to its ideological roots of forced secularism. Meanwhile, Pope Francis especially has proven himself to be an enthusiastic political figure, inserting himself into a series of issues such as the Russia-Ukraine war, social issues, and more, with his influence even reaching as far as the Middle East, as evident by a 2021 visit to Iraq, thought to have been a seminal event for the country that's recent history has been marred by a large amount of religious violence. The papal visit serving as a sort of statement by the Iraqi government of a new coming era of interreligious cooperation and peace. Now, this of course isn't to say that the Vatican is responsible either for the fall of communism within Eastern Europe or the end of religious violence in Iraq, but instead to highlight how this question is more than just a morbid curiosity. Okay, so now that all that's out of the way, again I ask, who will be the next pope? Well, here are the prime candidates, starting with candidate 1, Cardinal Pietro Parolin. So, if history is anything to go by, it would seem almost certain that the next pope will be Italian, with the links between Italy and the Vatican being plain for all to see. Not only in the fact that the Vatican is literally located at the heart of Italy, but also in the history of Italians being elected as pope. As since 1522, only 4 popes have not been Italian, and of all eligible Italian cardinals, few are as high profile as Pietro Parolin. Parolin, who holds the title of the Holy See's Secretary of State, is not only the Vatican's most senior diplomat, but also a complete heavyweight on the wider geopolitical scale. As in his role, Parolin is very uniquely positioned to be highly influential, specifically amongst Catholic countries. In Venezuela, for example, Parolin is reported to have been a seminal figure in peace talks between incumbent President Nicolas Maduro and anti-government protesters, and in addition reported to have been a seminal figure in the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba during the Obama administration, as well as strengthening Vatican relations with a previously very Vatican skeptic China, which, irrespective of where you stand on these specific issues, nonetheless show Parolin to be a very proactive figure within wider geopolitics, something that has obviously garnered him with significant respect not only on the wider geopolitical level, but also within the Vatican itself, something that could very easily ultimately translate to him becoming the next pope. But, in a sense, Parolin's proactive nature is not only his greatest strength, but also his greatest weakness, as due to his proactive nature, Parolin has actually become quite a polarizing figure in geopolitics, even garnering significant criticism from the Trump regime, which may ultimately lead a lot of cardinals to ultimately shy away from the idea of Parolin being the next pope. Though, nonetheless, Parolin remains a prime candidate, so in light of that, I will give Parolin a 3 out of 5 white robes chance of being next pope. Which now brings us to our second Italian candidate in Cardinal Giorgio Maregno. So, Cardinal Giorgio Maregno is actually quite an interesting candidate in that, whilst his accomplishments pale in comparison to rival candidates such as Parolin, his X-factor stems from his status as the youngest cardinal in the Vatican. And in addition to being young, Maregno also seems to be quite a cool guy, being well versed in the sport of fencing and an avid outdoorsman. Aspects which, trivial as they may sound, may ultimately do a lot of good for the Vatican, specifically amongst younger people, a demographic that they seem to be losing influence with at exponential rates, and something that they will without a doubt wish to arrange, with Maregno seemingly being the perfect candidate for doing so. Furthermore, as one of the closest aides to Pope Francis, who is obviously at the moment the most influential figure in the Vatican, Maregno can very easily sneak into proceedings. Though, with that being said, Maregno's age can ultimately act a lot more to his detriment than to his benefit. And the reason for this is due to the current state of internal Vatican politics. So currently split between the theologically liberal camp that is open to a series of reforms in reference to women's rights, LGBT inclusion, and a series of other reforms, and the theologically conservative camp that is starkly against any sort of reforms. The Vatican is currently at somewhat of a crossroads. The identity of the next pope, and more specifically, which side of the ideological camp he belongs to, is said to be a very important part of Vatican history. And with Maregno, alongside Pope Francis seemingly belonging to the theologically liberal camp, it is highly likely that the idea of Maregno being the next pope will lead to a lot of resistance, specifically from the theologically conservative camp, due to the fact that it will essentially place him at the forefront of the Vatican decision-making process for the next 20, 30, or even 40 years, something that the theologically conservative camp will obviously want to avoid at all costs. So, in light of that, I will give Cardinal Maregno a 1.5 out of 5 white robes chance of being next pope. Which now brings us to our final Italian cardinal in candidate 3, Cardinal Pierbattista Pizzaballa. Which is probably the most Italian-sounding name I've ever heard, but I digress. So, holding the highest-ranking title in Jerusalem, the Catholic faith's most holy site, Pizzaballa, by way of title alone, can make a pretty serious claim for the papacy. However, in reality, Pizzaballa's merits actually go way beyond his title. So let's take a moment to talk about Jerusalem, a city which, as some people may be aware, is a pretty significant area not only for Christians, but also for Jews and Muslims, with the latter two faiths actually being the more relevant players for this story, because Jerusalem is actually claimed as the official capital city of both Israel and Palestine, thus essentially placing Pizzaballa at the forefront of one of the most contentious issues of our times, the Israel-Palestine conflict. a conflict which Pizzaballa has actually taken quite a balanced and measured approach to, even garnering himself universal praise for his offer to Hamas to exchange himself for the Israeli hostages taken by Hamas, a move which is pretty Catholic, I would say, which, believe it or not, is a lot rarer in the Vatican than you'd think. With Pizzaballa's efforts in Israel-Palestine ultimately proving themselves a lot more successful even than the seasoned Parolin, thus showing him to potentially be even more slick than the seasoned diplomat. However, Pizzaballa's proclivity for balancing polarizing issues is actually a lot more advantageous than you'd think, especially in light of the current ideological divide internally within the Vatican between theological conservatives and theological liberals. Notably, with Pizzaballa not wedding himself to any particular side of the divide, which essentially places Pizzaballa in a very advantageous position as almost a perfect compromise candidate. Not the first choice for any of the two sides, but nonetheless a stomachable option for both. And yet, Pizzaballa nonetheless possesses quite an ironic weakness. So remember how I mentioned that since 1522 only 4 popes have not been Italian? Well, of these 4 popes, 3 of them have actually been the last 3 popes. This trend seemingly indicating a desire within the Vatican to be a lot more representative of the global Catholic community, which of course extends way beyond Italy, something which could wind up placing quite an ironic wrench in any hope of Pizzaballa becoming the next pope. Though nonetheless, Pizzaballa still remains a prime candidate and probably the best placed Italian cardinal to take the role. So in light of that, I will give Cardinal Pizzaballa a 4 out of 5 white robes chance of becoming the next pope. Which in turn begs the question, who are the primary non-Italian cardinal candidates? Well, what a perfect segue to candidate 4, Cardinal Mario Grech. And for this cardinal candidate, we actually need not move far from Italy at all, as only a couple miles away, within the tiny island of Malta, quite an interesting candidate has begun to get bandied about. So Cardinal Mario Grech, who actually has a reputation as somewhat of a stringent conservative, was actually made as cardinal by the highly liberal Pope Francis. This highlighting how, despite his conservative past, Cardinal Mario Grech can nonetheless be considered yet another compromise candidate that may ultimately be stomachable for both sides. Furthermore, as the national of a tiny and, for the most part, pretty inoffensive country with neutrality at the forefront of its constitution, Cardinal Mario Grech's appointment is also unlikely to ruffle many feathers on the wider geopolitical scale, thus making him potentially quite a desirable candidate. Though, with that being said, when it comes to compromise candidates, it really is hard to look past Pizzaballa, despite his Italian nationality. So, in light of that, I will give Cardinal Mario Grech a 2 out of 5 white robes chance of being next pope. Okay, so far we've talked quite a lot about the ideological divide between theological conservatives and theological liberals, whilst at the same time, with the exception of Cardinal Moreno, talking very little about the main candidates from both sides. So in light of that, it will probably make sense at this point to start talking about said candidates, starting with, from the conservative side, candidate 5, Cardinal Peter Erdo. So, Cardinal Peter Erdo, the Archbishop of Budapest, is actually quite an interesting case study in that, whilst his position is not exactly the most prestigious in the Vatican, he's nonetheless arguably the second most influential figure within the Vatican, trailing only to Pope Francis himself. And the main reason for this is him essentially placing himself as the polar opposite to Pope Francis. So, whereas Pope Francis is in favor of the inclusion of LGBT people in church proceedings, Cardinal Peter Erdo is starkly against it. Whereas Pope Francis is in favor of the reinterpretation of medieval practices, Cardinal Erdo is starkly against it. Where Pope Francis is in favor of housing asylum seekers, Cardinal Peter Erdo is, again, starkly against it, even going so far as to not house asylum seekers himself, a situation that has elevated Cardinal Peter Ardaugh into somewhat of an opposition leader within the Vatican, limited in terms of structural power, but potent in terms of influence, something that has led commentators to label him as the leader of the conservative camp within the Vatican. And of course, in light of this, Peter Ardaugh therefore enjoys some very passionate support for him being the next pope. But the flip side to that would be an equally passionate resistance to the idea, of course, from the liberal camp, meaning that Cardinal Ardaugh's chances are very limited by this aspect, though nonetheless he still remains a prime candidate, especially from the conservative camp. So in light of that, I will give Cardinal Peter Ardaugh a 4 out of 5 white robes chance of being next pope. Okay, so far we've talked about 5 candidates who, whilst all very different in their style, substance, and philosophy, nonetheless share one common trait. A geographic similarity, if you like, or more specifically, a continental one. So the place of the European continent within Roman Catholic tradition is obviously a very profound one, because whilst it's not exactly the continent where the religion was founded, it's nonetheless the main area in which it ultimately spread through missionary operations, or as we'd call them now, forced conversion and colonialism. But that's a whole different story for another time. Not relevant for this story other than to highlight how influential the continent has been in Roman Catholic tradition. Influence which has of course translated to most popes being European, with the stranglehold of European popes even reaching far beyond the Italian one. As over the scope of over 1,200 years, only 2 popes have not been European. The Syrian Pope Gregory III, who reigned between 722 and 732, and the Argentinian Pope Francis, who reigns now. So, in light of that, one can therefore understand just how game-changing Pope Francis's appointment has been. So much so that it seems likely that even the next pope will not be European himself. The main reason for this, of course, being the obvious one that non-Europeans are just as capable as Europeans. But the other reason's a lot more political. So, although European expansion and colonialism is undoubtedly the main reason why the Roman Catholic tradition is currently as large as it is, the realities of modern-day Europe actually paint quite a glum picture for the Vatican, as many Europeans have either abandoned religion altogether or, in some manner, prefer secular governance over religious intrusion, as evident by a series of social reforms that have been passed despite some very significant Vatican resistance. This trend likely being one of the primary reasons for the rise of liberal theology within the Vatican, ironically led by the non-European Pope Francis, who aims to modernize the Roman Catholic faith to be more in line with this new zeitgeist. But in other parts of the globe, specifically the developing world, religion still plays a primary role within public life, which in turn has led many commentators to claim that the current center of the Roman Catholic faith is actually located outside of Europe, something which should logically translate to a non-European pope, something which even Pope Francis himself seems to have bought into, as evident by his appointment of a series of non-European cardinals who are more likely to cast their vote for non-Europeans. Which of course begs the question, who are the primary non-European candidates? Well, what a divine segue to Candidate 6, Cardinal Peter Turkson. So, having been appointed by Pope Benedict XVI in 2009, Turkson boasts not only extensive experience, but also a significant public life record. Because, as arguably the most prominent African cardinal, the Ghanaian Turkson has essentially been the go-to person for navigating Vatican responses to any issues in the African world, having been the central clerical envoy during a series of conflicts in Ivory Coast, South Sudan, and more, thus significantly boosting his public life record. Furthermore, as the national of a country with vast religious plurality in which Catholicism is actually a minority, Turkson bears the potential to highly excel in one of the few nonpartisan issues within the Vatican, interreligious dialogue. And yet, despite all this, Turkson, in reality, is actually quite unlikely to benefit too much from his nationality, mainly due to his highly conservative views, specifically as it relates to LGBT rights. So, as we already mentioned, certain sectors of the Vatican seem to be heavily pushing for a non-European pope to be the next in line. But considering that Pope Francis seems to be very enthusiastic about the idea himself, this does seem to indicate said push to be stemming predominantly from the Vatican's liberal section, in part due to its desire to see more representation, which has in turn created quite an ironic paradox. Because, as per most indications, it seems that the majority of cardinals stemming from developing countries, much like Turkson, usually tend to be a lot more conservative in their approach, specifically as it relates to LGBT rights, the acceptance of divorced persons in church proceedings, and more. Meaning that cardinals in the ilk of Turkson are in turn unlikely to enjoy much support from the liberal camp, whilst in the conservative camp, which generally speaking seems to be a lot less concerned with representation, the preference for Erdo seems to be quite unanimous. So, in light of that, I will give Turkson a 2 out of 5 white robes chance of becoming the next pope. Okay, so far we've talked quite a lot about the liberal camp whilst only alluding to a single candidate from this end. One who, as we already mentioned, is not necessarily the most likely candidate. Which therefore begs the question, who are the frontrunner candidates from the liberal group? Well, what a divine segue to Candidate 7, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez. So, if Pope Francis was to be in charge of picking his successor, which he's not, Cardinal Fernandez will without a doubt get a 5 out of 5 white robes chance of becoming the next pope. And as one of the recently appointed cardinals, it would seem as if Pope Francis is attempting to position his fellow Argentinian as his successor, with the pair's connection running far beyond the shared nationality, as with decades of history between the two, Fernandez is probably at present Pope Francis's most trusted advisor. Predominantly an academic by nature, Fernandez has probably served as Pope Francis's primary ideological partner in fostering his highly liberal theology, by Vatican standards that is, specifically as it relates to a series of hot topic subjects such as LGBT rights, divorced persons' inclusions, changes of interpretations in scripture, and more. This relationship leading many Vatican insiders to label Fernandez as Pope Francis's ghostwriter, and so Cardinal Fernandez would undoubtedly be the first choice for anybody who wished to see a continuation of a Pope Francis-style papacy. And yet, despite this, Cardinal Fernandez is actually very unlikely to be next in line for the papacy. The main reason for this being his fervent unpopularity within the conservative camp, who perceive him as the hypothetical devil on the shoulder of Pope Francis. Furthermore, in light of the fact that Cardinal Fernandez has described himself as even more liberal than Pope Francis, the conservative camp is undoubtedly going to draw a harsh stance against his appointment. So, in light of that, Cardinal Fernandez will get a 1 out of 5 white robes chance of becoming the next pope, with Fernandez being further inhibited by a more obvious candidate within the liberal camp, in Candidate 8. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. So, Cardinal Tagle is a very fascinating candidate to talk about. Having served as the Archbishop of Manila from 2011 to 2020, his public experience is almost exclusively limited to the national level. And yet, despite this, Tagle is nonetheless one of the most high-profile prelates within the Catholic Church, probably due to his profile ticking so many papal boxes, foremost amongst them being his nationality, as both the third most populated Catholic nation in the globe, and alongside the tiny nation of Timor-Leste, the only Catholic majority nation in Asia, the Philippines is not only an important geopolitical actor on a global scale, but also amongst a group of nations with a higher reported level of religiosity, and by extension, influence for the Vatican. a nation in which Tugla is at present by far the most recognizable face. However, this certainly isn't to say that Tugla's only offer to the Vatican stems from his nationality. Far from it, in fact, as Tugla's qualifications for the role actually reaches far beyond that. Often described as a gifted and charismatic orator, Tugla has won more than a few supporters within the Vatican itself. However, Tugla's appeal actually spans far beyond the limits of the Vatican, as the Filipino cardinal also enjoys widespread grassroots support. Often referred to as just Chito rather than by his official title, Tugla has throughout the years been able to foster a concrete, man-of-the-people type of appeal, a quality which would prove invaluable for the Vatican, which obviously aims to widen its appeal as much as possible. And in this sense, Tugla shares a lot of similarities with Pope Francis, which does in turn mean that his support is going to stem predominantly from the liberal camp, not least of all due to his openness to LGBT issues and divorced persons, with him being the first Asian pope, a further bonus for said camp. Meanwhile, from the conservative camp, Tugla would, at the very least, be a much more stomachable option than other liberal alternatives, mainly due to his willingness to be a lot more diplomatic and sympathetic to their concerns. Meaning that, whilst not a compromise candidate per se, the conservative camp may nonetheless be inclined to view Tugla as an improvement upon Pope Francis, who is often a little bit more of a renegade when it comes to breaking unspoken rules and protocols. So in light of that, I will give Cardinal Tugla a 4.5 out of 5 white robes chance of becoming the next pope. Meaning that Tugla is so far the front runner in this race, with Pizzaballa and Erdo trailing slightly behind. But before ending this video, I would first like to talk about one more potential option. But before that, some honorable mentions. Cardinal Robert Serra, alongside Turkson, probably the highest profile African cardinal, but given that he is arguably more conservative than Turkson, likely to encounter similar barriers. Cardinal Marc Aulé, a long-standing cardinal who was a serious contender in both 2005 and 2013, but whose time has most likely passed now. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, a serious Vatican heavyweight who, in truth, is probably a lot more of an advisor than a pope himself. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, yet another high-ranking Italian cardinal who may serve as a potential dark horse. Cardinal Odilo Scherer, arguably the highest profile candidate in the most populated Catholic nation, Brazil, but still currently behind the primary frontrunners. And finally, candidate 9, Cardinal Other. So these types of videos, thoroughly researched as they are almost always wrong. And add that to the fact that not only are there potentially hundreds of candidates for the role, and an overall process that is, well, not exactly the most transparent in the world, and, well, hitting the bullseye on this issue becomes quite an uphill task. Or in other words, the likelihood of the next pope being somebody that we've never really heard of is just as likely as any other option, especially if Pope Francis does wind up lasting a lot longer in the role than we'd think. Meaning that Cardinal Other will get a 4.5 out of 5 white robes chance of becoming the next pope.
So, what do you think? Are there any candidates that I'm missing out on? And does this question even matter? I'd really like to know what you think in the comments, so please feel free to give your 2 cents below. And whilst you're there, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be alerted of future videos. This has been Sean from Into the Ether. Thanks for watching, and ciao!